All right, welcome back to another lesson. This time we will be talking about a global government. Last time we discussed anarchy, the idea of having no government, which was also a utopian society. We looked at how that philosophy broke down and in practice and in principle. So if no government does not work, as we discussed last week, maybe all the government will work. And by that I mean having one government to rule them all. So that's this week's lesson's title, Conquering the World, One Government to Rule Them All. And so a one world government can also be viewed as a utopian society, often depicted as the most ideal society to live in. Even though many have pushed for a one world government, we've yet to reach one. Science fiction is one place that many have explored the idea. We often see either a one world government already implemented or a story of how one developed. The TV show Star Trek has a global government implied, but it's not really the focus of the story. However, the background statement of the direction the author would hope we move towards. Now, in one of my personal favorite animes, Gundam 00, shows how the one world would be forced to unite under a global threat known as the Celestial Beings. Many point to climate change, poverty, overpopulation, and most notably, war, as reasons why we need a global government, because those would be the only things that could be solved through a global government. These are reasons that some press the idea urgently to move towards a global government. The main thing to draw from these ideas of world requires only the right global disaster, forcing us to unify. We've yet had that disaster, but we are certainly on track to move in that direction. The question now becomes, is a one world government desirable, and is it even attainable opposed to what we currently have, known as sovereign nations or states? So the idea of a one world government has been around for ages. And it's actually nothing new. Many kingdoms and empires have made statements of conquest to rule all that the sun shines on. This shows the imperialistic behavior of many empires and nations wanting to take over the world for whatever reason, be it power or fame. The Italian philosopher-poet Dante, who wrote Dante's Inferno, argued wars and all reasons for war would be stopped if we implemented a monarchy governing all under a single ruler, stating because he possesses everything, the ruler would not desire to possess anything further, and thus he would hold kings contently within the borders of their kingdoms and keep peace among them. Essentially, Dante is arguing that if there is no more land to conquer, then there would be no need for war, since much of war at the time was over expansion of empires. Peace cannot be maintained if humanity is divided, of course, so peace can only be obtainable under a shared goal and one emperor to rule, right? At least that is what Dante is kind of arguing here. So taking over the world would not mean the end of wars, really. The idea that having a global monarchy would solve the problem of wars is short-sighted, for there are many more reasons for war than just expansion, such as the Civil War, religious wars, revolutionary wars. I kind of think the idea of if a family has arguments who have no interest over expansion, then so would powers under this king, and wars could easily still erupt. Dante stated that a one-world government would closely resemble God by mirroring the principles of oneness or unity of which he is supreme example. If the whole world was Christian, then this might be easy. But of course, Dante acknowledges there will be problems that would arise, though this would be the main task of the monarch to resolve any disputes of lower rulers. Dante may have been rightly motivated, seeking the end of war and trying to create something resembling God's oneness, but was he missing part of the picture? So within the realm of a one world government, we must first look to the concept of kings. And so conceptually, kings are not inherently wrong. The idea of having a global monarch would solve the problem of wars is short-sighted, I'd say, for there are many more reasons for war. But kings are not inherently wrong. God stated in Genesis 17:6, I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings shall come from you. When telling Abraham of the blessing that will come to be in Deuteronomy, there was even instructions for those kings before Israel even had a king to rule them. Now, C.S. Lewis criticized the call for the abolition of monarchies as contrary to human nature, writing, where men are forbidden to honor a king, they honor millionaires, athletes, or film stars instead, even famous prostitutes or gangsters for spiritual nature. Like bodily nature will be served, deny it food, and it will gobble poison. So he's arguing that it is natural for hierarchies to exist and that honoring and idolizing movie stars or millionaires will get you nowhere. In contrast, a king will have you focused on the bigger picture of the movement of the nation, in a sense. Like what's happening, you're going to be thinking about bigger pictures, where with a millionaire, you're going to be just thinking, oh, what is he buying? What is he doing? What is his luxurious life like? So C.S. Lewis is kind of showing the distinction there. So kingdoms and empires are as good as the leader that rules, especially if the king has a complete authority. Israel went from good to bad to worse over and over again with their kings. God warned them of what they asked for. And so we will look at what was said in 1 Samuel 8, 4 through 21. This is a well-known passage talking on kings. So all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, you are old, and your sons do not follow your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as the other nations have. But when they said, give us a king to us, this displeased Samuel. He prayed to the Lord, and the Lord told him, listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king, as they have done from the day I brought them out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are doing to you. Now listen to them, but warn them solemnly, and let them know what the king who will reign over them will claim as his rights. Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, this is what the king who will reign over you will claim as his rights. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of fifties, and others to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and still others to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take a tenth of your grain and of your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants. Your male and female servants, and the best of your cattle and donkeys, he will take for his own use. He will take a tenth of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his slaves. When that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen. But the Lord will not answer you in that day. But the people refused to listen to Samuel. No, they said, we want a king over us. Then we will be like all the other nations, with a king to lead us and to go out before us and fight our battles. When Samuel heard all that the people said, he repeated it before the Lord. So reading all this, at first, Samuel took the request of a king personally. He was already judging and, in a sense, taking care of Israel through the guidance of God. But God told him, it is not you whom they reject, but him. God made an interesting analogy that Israel worshipped false gods as they wanted a king instead of having a prophet. So a king, just like a false god, cannot save you. This showed that a king is similar to the false god that must be created, built up from nothing, and worshipped, but neither can save them. The people no longer wanted to be ruled and judged by God, but by man, someone they could relate to in the flesh and blood, one who could lead them on the battlefield. God warned that a king will take their children to work in his kingdom or for a standing military that they did not have previously. Land would be taken, and worst of all, a tax would be levied to support a king and his luxurious life to be served. And a tax would also needed to be taken to support a growing government that was not previously there either. Samuel, on his final speech to Israel, he lays out what the Israelites truly asked for. So this takes place after, in a sense, they've already had the king for a while, in his response. So he says, "And when you saw that Nasha, king of the Amorites, came against you, you said to me, 'No, but a king shall reign over us, when the Lord your God was your king. Now therefore, here is the king whom you have chosen, and whom you have desired. And take note, the Lord has set a king over you. If you fear the Lord and serve him and obey his voice and do not rebel against the commandments of the Lord, then both you and the king who reigns over you will continue following the Lord your God. However, if you do not obey the voice of the Lord, but rebel against the commandments of the Lord, then the hand of the Lord will be against you as it was against your fathers. Now therefore, stand and see this great thing which the Lord will do before your eyes. Is today not the wheat harvest? I will call to the Lord, and he will send thunder and rain, that you may perceive and see that your wickedness is great, which you have done in the sight of the Lord, in asking a king for yourselves." So Samuel called to the Lord, and the Lord sent thunder and rain that day. And all the people greatly feared the Lord and Samuel. And all the people said to Samuel, "Pray for your servants to the Lord your God, that we may not die, for we have added to all our sins the evil of asking a king for ourselves." Then Samuel said to the people, "Do not fear. You have done all this wickedness. Yet do not turn aside from following the Lord, but serve the Lord with all your heart, and do not turn aside, for then you would go after empty things which cannot profit or deliver, for they are nothing. For the Lord will not forsake his people for his great name's sake, because it has pleased the Lord to make you his people. Moreover, as for me, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord in ceasing to pray for you. But I will teach you the good and the right way. Only fear the Lord and serve him in truth with all your heart, for consider what great things he has done for you. But if you still do wickedly, you shall be swept away, both you and your king." So a prophet is the voice of God, which Samuel was, while a king is self-serving. So he reminded them that before the king God gave them, judges and prophets protected them until a king was approaching. They demanded a king when God was already their king who led them. And so a prophet and a judge is beholden to God, while a king is beholden first to his own interests and then to the people, I would say, if they're loud enough. A prophet was the voice of God. Samuel stated that requesting a replacement for God was a great sin and proved it with thunder and rain. The people were greatly afraid and repented for asking for a king. But Samuel essentially said, "You asked for a king, you are now stuck with this king." Now, we discussed why in a sense, they were stuck is because last time we discussed the concept of being anti-government, being, anarchy, is that the Bible is against revolutions and anti-government sentiment, in a sense. And so once Israel transitioned to a kingship, a monarch, he's like, well, God's not for anti-government, you're stuck with this, we can't revolt, we can't do a revolution. So society will succeed as long as it is moral. Samuel said, "You and your king can still be protected by God if you obey and seek after God. Otherwise, God will judge you." Samuel lays out clearly that society can succeed whether or not one has a king, but how well they are obedient to God and are moral. So it must be the goal of society and any form of government to focus on the morality. Some might argue against forcing morality on people, but I would say all laws are forms of morality. Having laws against murder is a moral law, just as every law determines what is and isn't right. The only issue is the discrepancies on what should and shouldn't be legal. Now, the nation of Israel had both good and bad kings. Now, the percentage of each was different based on which part of Israel they ruled. God originally set up a method to help prevent corruption by having the kings read this passage. You shall surely set a king over you, whom the Lord your God chooses, one from among your brethren. You shall set a king over you. You may not set a foreigner over you, who is not your brother. But he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. For the Lord has said to you, you shall not return that way again. Neither shall he multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away. Nor shall he greatly multiply silver and gold for himself. Also it shall be, when he sits on that throne of his kingdom, that he shall write for himself a copy of this law in a book, for the one before the priests, the Levites. And it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, and be careful to observe all the words of this law and those statutes, that his heart may not be lifted above his brethren, that he may not turn aside from the commandments to the right hand or to the left, and that he may prolong his days in his kingdom, he and his children in the midst of Israel. So he was supposed to read this every day, and it seems that he at least wrote it once in the eyes of a Levite. And this was in a sense so to remind him not to become prideful or greedy in any way, for they would be his downfall. Israel started out with a single king, which was Saul, who was tall, handsome, humble, and successful until it went to his head, and he became prideful. God replaced him with David, who was a man after God's own heart. And God promised that David's family should reign forever. Solomon became the last king to rule the whole nation. For after the death of Solomon, the kingdom was divided. 10 tribes formed the northern kings, called Israel, and Judah and Benjamin formed the southern tribes, called Judah. So here's a kind of breakdown of every king that ruled Israel and Judah, or the north and the south tribes, and kind of a sentence or a couple words summarizing their reign. And so all the kings of the northern tribes ended up being corrupt and wicked, 20 out of 20. While the southern tribes still ended up with mostly bad kings, they had a handful of good kings, 8 out of 20 about. You could push those numbers up depending on certain things. But now, why did the northern tribes end up not having any good kings, while the southern tribes had some good kings? I would say it was particularly the corruption of society. The northern tribes started off falling into pagan practices, and the culture was destroyed, making it hard to get a good king, since you'll only have as good a king as your selection has to offer. And if your culture that influences the people is very bad, then the king who are also influenced would stay corrupt. This is a perpetual corruption in a sense, making reform very difficult. While the southern tribes did start out with not the best king, he did not fall into paganism, and the society did not become as corrupt, making it easier to return or reform if things did go wrong. This is where culture needs to be preserved by morality, and the government should do its best to support this. Government is the downstream of culture, they say, so once your culture goes bad, so does your government. This is the struggle we, as Americans, are currently facing. But since government has the power, their responsibility is to keep society moral. The United States used to teach the Bible in public schools because they understood that principle. And since we removed the Bible and prayer out of the school system, our culture has been slowly becoming more and more corrupt. It should be obvious that if you take away morality from the institutions that teach children how to think, that immorality will obviously grow. It's another passage here. Kings essentially can lean towards dictatorships and become oppressive. And so I found this verse in 1 Kings 12:13-14, which states, "Then the king answered the people roughly and rejected the advice of which the elders had given him, and he spoke to them according to the advice of the young men, saying, 'My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scourges.'" So that's not too friendly, I would say. Wouldn't want to hear my king say that, but essentially saying it was bad before, well, get ready for me, I'm gonna make it 10 times worse. And so Rehoboam took over as king and flexed how much strength he would rule with that the people will have it hard, very hard. Now here's the Roman Empire. Bringing it back, though, to what Dante was talking about, Dante seemed to admire maybe the Roman Empire, possibly for the Pax Romana, which was a period of relative peace and stability across the Roman Empire, one of the largest empires ever to be formed, which lasted for over 200 years, beginning with the reign of Augustus. Though Rome kept its peace by force. Riots would pop up occasionally, but were stomped out by the police force. The people eventually viewed the king as God for mostly keeping the peace in such a large empire. Now, unless outside forces intervene or limit their power, a king can easily become corrupt. Obviously, the Roman empires felt they were gods and deserved absolute allegiance from their point of view. The only way to have a society with a king would be to limit his power, either by constitutions that they had to follow, or term limits, or a way to replace the king without a revolution, but democratically. Going back to Dante's ideal government, under a monarch, he stated that he would have the highest authority and would be responsible to solve the problems of lower kings. Though the Bible seems to warn against giving a single person so much power, especially over the entire world, whoever this person would be would most likely end up corrupted by the power and may even be worshipped as a god, just like the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire wasn't even the ruler of the whole world. It was only in control of this map right here, which, sure, very large. And at the time, most people thought that was a lot of the planet, It seems the best solution is to spread the authority out. So it's hard to corrupt, but also a single person would have a hard time managing everything, just as Moses couldn't hear all the problems of his people. He had to set up lower court. So man cannot handle such power without becoming corrupt. This is why God has stressed heavily that kings will be the downfall, in a sense. And essentially this does boil down to man being too corruptible to handle such power. That the only one who could rule singularly without becoming corrupt would be God himself, who is obviously king in heaven. And on the kingdom of God, he is already ruling. But what about earth? Depending on your eschatology, Jesus will return to reign on earth during the millennial kingdom. God's kingdom on earth will begin on his second coming. Now, there is a debate on whether the church will be raptured pre-trib, post-trib, or even mid-trib. But for those who are not post-millennial and all-mill, then Jesus will be ruling the earth, but with force. In Revelations 2:26-27, it states, "And he who overcomes and keeps my words until the end, to him I will give power over the nations. He shall rule them with a rod of iron. They shall be dashed to pieces like the potter's vessels. Earth will one day be ruled by a king, but that day will not be until Jesus returns." Dante may have had this in mind, but it is clear we cannot achieve the same without God in power. Although we may see a different global government come to power in the form of a federation of nations, which we will look at next time. So I'll leave you with these few takeaways. God is the only legitimate king for us. There may be another king that may be placed in power, but God is our true king. And that is something that is constantly stated amongst church or pastors when a new president comes into office, stating, yes, this guy may be good or not good, whether it be whichever person, but they always reassure, do not worship this president, do not worship the leadership. This person can do good, but at the end of the day, God is in control and God is the one doing everything. So God is our only true legitimate king and ruler. So now, personally, you can take away from this, no matter what power or leadership you are given, you are not better than anyone else and need to stay humble. That was, in a sense, part of the daily reading that the king had to read, was that you are one among the men, in a sense. You're not better than anyone else. You have just a different responsibility now as a king. And the same goes for you and I, for whatever leadership or power we are given. We're not better than anyone else. We're not doing anything more, or we just have different leadership. So another is, kings and other authorities should be respected since God put them there, but should never be worshipped or thought that they will solve all of your problems. And so that should just be a given. And so one last thing to think about is, to keep society strong, one needs to keep morals at the center of society. And I believe this is one of the key practices the government should also intervene in. So without morals, it will crumble. Society will crumble and we will become corrupt. And that is what is happening now. And so those are things that you can take away from this lesson. So thank you for listening in. See you next time, where we'll be discussing more of a federation of nations.